that really took on a life of its own not so long ago, when in a book that she wrote on Puritan history, she wrote sort of the comment that, and Laurel, you may have to correct me on this.
It's okay.
Well-behaved women seldom make history.
Right.
And so now there are T-shirts, banners, posters, what I think is a truly amazing phrase. But what Laurel will share with us tonight is another critical, burning passion of hers, which is using history to really take any object one can imagine and bring it to life and use it as an opportunity to cross the beams, if you will, of every kind of historical analysis that's imaginable. So that when we think of the objects that we tend to look at in museums, we tend to think of things that are incredibly precious as the only things that are of value, the only things that have power. And what I think Laurel will share with us tonight is the fact that from the perspective of history, from the perspective of human history, any object is imbued with enormous power and can teach us a lot about the world and about ourselves. So please join me in welcoming Laurel Ulrich.
Okay, I am usually more comfortable where I can see people. And can you hear me? I'm mic'd up. Okay, I want to get a little bit acquainted with you if I can before I begin talking about tangible things. Have any of you checked out the edX course called Tangible Things? I want to know if I have any. You, one person. Oh, well, great. We've got a fresh group to persuade, and if I need help, I'll call on you. Okay. Did any of you see the exhibit, Tangible Things, in 2011 when it was in the Harvard museums? No. One person. Okay. Good. This is fun to be able to be talking to a fresh group about something that, as Rob said, I am very excited about. So Tangible Things has multiple forms. It started more than 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, when I was in an elevator going up to the top of what used to be called Holyoke Center, you know, where Obanpan is over there, and on Mass Ave. And this tall gentleman in the elevator said, "Are you Laurel?" And I'm Ivan. And we had both been invited to the same meeting, which was to talk about an old house that Harvard had received as a gift in the 1920s and hadn't done anything with. So Ivan Gaskell, who was then a curator at the Fogg Art Museum, and I, who was still relatively new at Harvard in the history department, had been invited to come and consult with Harvard Real Estate and Planning. I mean, who do you put in charge of an old house? Harvard Real Estate and Planning. And they didn't know what to do with a historic house except keep the roof on and keep things repaired. So that began a long collaboration between Ivan, who's British, who's trained as an art historian, who's an expert on Vermeer and other Dutch painting, and me. And I am interested in common things in women's history, in early American history, in the history of ordinary life. And we hit it off. And for about 10 years, taught small seminars in the Harvard History Department where we introduced students to ways of writing and discovering history by looking at objects, all kinds of objects. Sometimes we were in the Fogg Art Museum looking at 17th century silver, or in the conservation area of the Peabody Museum looking at some of Lewis and Clark's collections. And sometimes we were looking at a skillet, or we were looking at ordinary things that had accumulated over many years in the Artemus Ward House out in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, that strange Harvard property that had brought us together in the first time. And so we decided that we'd had such a good experience with working together with small groups, really hands-on investigation of tangible things, that we would try scaling up this project in a way. And we had a bright idea that took us more than a year to try to figure out how to bring to fruition, but we did. It just about killed us, but we did. And we decided we wanted to teach a general education course in 2011, which would introduce students to Harvard's, as a university, its relationship with the larger world beyond Harvard, from 1636 to the present, and we would call this tangible things. And there were a lot of steps in getting this general education course. But how do you take what turned out to be 260 students who signed up for this course, to our total amazement? How do you engage them with stuff? We had been used to being in small seminars where we could just bring it onto the table and talk about it. So our scheme was to develop an exhibit that would be part of the source material for the course, and that every week students would be engaged in some part of that exhibit, and by the end of the semester they would also be engaged with their own tangible things through the cooperation of the many 17 collections in Harvard who agreed to work with us. So, tangible things. Why precisely do these objects make a world, Henry Thoreau said. What a miscellaneous bunch of stuff. We had about 260 objects, mostly small, because we had a small space for our core exhibit. And we've taught now, I'm just about ready to finish the third time of teaching the general education course, Tangible Things. The exhibit that I'm going to describe for you just happened once, but the ideas that we developed out of that exhibit developed into a book. This semester we were able to use it as a text in our course, and we were able to use the major ideas of the exhibit as we taught in the general education program. So, what were the ideas? Well, the main idea is that any object can become an entry point into historical investigation. The shoes on your feet, the chair you're sitting on, the light fixtures in the room, the clothing that you're wearing, the beautiful necklace that you have on. Common things have stories. Museum objects have stories, and any of these can be developed. But there's a problem with the way Harvard, all right, here's the bottom line. There is a problem with the way Harvard uses its collections. It's remarkable how many students go through 4 or graduate students, maybe 8 years on campus and never get inside a museum. The other problem, because they have been primarily disconnected from the larger community. Art history students use the art museums, and maybe more students go into the art museums than in other places. It's mainly public school children who flock in to the Natural History Museum. They're not a natural part of university level courses. And Harvard has some 60 discrete connections of amazing things. Some of these are organized into museums, some are hidden in closets and storage areas of libraries or classroom buildings. They're not accessible. Some are across the river at the medical school. Some are out in Shrewsbury, as I said. So, one of the reasons that these many things have not been available and part of the curriculum is because of a historical change. In the 19th century, many of the fields that our students study today didn't exist. They grew out of the collecting of tangible things. Natural history began as a collecting enterprise. Scientific instruments began as objects used in laboratories and now are historical scientific instruments primarily used by students in the history of science. Anthropology developed out of collections. And by the end of the 19th century, there were history museums, anthropology museums, zoology museums, technology museums, and so on, each on its own tub, to use Harvard speak. So our desire was to break down the categories. And historians are kind of imperialists. I mean, we sort of think we can talk about anything. Everything's got a history. We don't even need to know very much about it. We can talk about it, right? So our goals were to engage students with physical things, to get them out of their computers for a few hours a week, and to break down categories between disciplines, and to make people more aware and alert about the world in which we live. So, in the collection of historic scientific instruments changing exhibit gallery on the second floor of the Science Center, which is a wonderful museum, and keep your eye on that next year and see what they'll come up with next. We arranged around the walls of this small gallery little mini exhibits according to categories. Here's anthropology, here are books and manuscripts, here's history, and so on. And then down the middle of the room, we created something that we called the muddle. And students came into this gallery. They looked, well, this is art, this is anthropology, this is history, you know, got it, sort of. And then we said, tell us where these things in the middle belong. And we made no effort to organize them in any way. So in the first case in the muddle, here is the death mask of Abraham Lincoln and a cast of his hands. Samuel Johnson's teapot, engraved with a long story. A few suffrage campaign buttons, women's suffrage campaign buttons from the Schlesinger Library, and a quilt from the Artemis Ward House. Where did they go? The teapot, believe it or not, is in Houghton Rare Books Library. Well, it is sort of a text. It's covered with engraving and with a story, but it's a teapot. What is a teapot doing in a library? The one of my favorite spots, in this case, we displayed on the left a cross-section of the transatlantic cable. The first transatlantic cable is a souvenir that we found in a drawer in a desk in the Artemis Ward House. On the right is a lovely bottle from the Warren Anatomical Museum of tapeworms taken from Boston Brahmins in the 19th century. And in between that is Harvard's 118-year-old tortilla. Now, I gave a lecture last week at the Radcliffe Institute on that tortilla, and it's really tempting to go on and on about the tortilla, but it's absolutely one of my favorite objects in the museum. It's in the Harvard herbaria. It's a botanical specimen, or sort of a botanical specimen, that became an ethnographic object that is now a historical document and has led our students on many adventures, not just into food history, but into history of ethnic conflict, history of immigration, history of migrations on both sides of the Mexican-US border, history of anthropology as it developed out of botanic collecting in the late 19th century. So what is it that we want students to get? We want them to have a little fun. We want to shake them up. We want to get them thinking in lateral ways outside their disciplines. In the Gen Ed course, we have students from all 4 Harvard undergraduate classes and from every part of the university. Science students next to history and lit students, and so on. What are we trying to get them to do? Well, yes, to think across categories. Yes, to pay attention to their own tangible world, to a world just, talk about hoarding. Think of our world. But also to think about Harvard in different ways. That it was not this ivory tower, but it was a place that was engaged in, yes, controversial things, things that are tough to talk about and deal with. That I will try to illustrate a bit of that by suggesting some of the third thing that we did in our exhibit. We had things in place along the sides of the gallery. We had things unplaced in the middle. And then we decided to place things out of place. So with the cooperation of some wonderful museums, we were able to convince them that it would be interesting to sort of just misplace something. Take it out of one collection and put it in another and see what would happen. And we put a little telephone number and a tangible things logo beside each of these 17 objects, where you could dial on your cell phone and you'd get a student telling you why the object was there and a little bit about it. So for example, on exhibit right now in the new Harvard Art Museum, in one of the galleries on the second floor is this lovely floriform vase by Louis Comfort Timpany. Beautiful, blown glass with the characteristic iridescence that Tiffany worked so hard to develop. We took that object and we put it in its own little case in the collection, the famous glass flowers in the Harvard Museum of Natural History. And it was transformative to walk into that gallery and see the colors, which were virtually identical. The technology, which was virtually identical. One was art, one was science. How do we distinguish? Where is the boundary when art becomes science or science becomes art? This was one of my favorites. We found in the Semitic Museum, one of the less known Harvard museums, a dog paw print in a mud brick from Nuzi in Mesopotamia, 1500 to 1300 BCE. And so it just seemed natural that that paw print should go next to a taxidermied specimen of a dog. Think about time. Think about the evolution of humans' relationship with animals and what that might mean. One of my absolute favorites, because I love the Schlesinger Library, is this from the Women's Rights collection, a tin bluebird that was tacked on fence posts and the side of barns during an unsuccessful campaign for women's suffrage in 1915. What could we do with this? Well, the kind, you know, and I think most people who were in that gallery walked right by and didn't even notice. But those who did notice got a little story about this unsuccessful campaign. And then when we began to write the book that was based on this exhibit, I had the amazing opportunity to say to myself, okay, what did I learn from this exercise? Because what we try to do in the course is get students then to learn something new by putting something out of place. And what I learned was about the Audubonnet movement. In the late 19th century, this is the way women's hats had begun to look until the Audubon Society, led by some very wonderful women, began to campaign to preserve the environment by getting those birds off women's hats. There were actually birds threatened with extinction because of women's fashion in the late 19th century. And I never thought about connecting birds and the women's rights movement until we put this curious thing in an exhibit case just to see what would happen. So what we do in the general education course is connect students with hundreds of little known and some very well known objects in Harvard's diverse collections. And I've hammered at them all semester this time. Look, question, connect. Those are the three things we want them to be able to do by the end of the semester. We think we look at things, but I've learned, and I think our students are learning, that we're very superficial. I think most people in a museum walk by and spend, you know, a matter of a few seconds on each object. So we really take Louis Agassiz' story, Look at the Fish, very, very seriously. It begins with looking, and that's the first skill that we learn. Then the looking raises questions, and we want them to make those questions explicit. And then the next effort, we want them to connect unexpected things. Women's rights and birds. Mesopotamia and the Harvard Museum of Natural History. Artworks and scientific specimens, and so on. So I'm going to race you through this exercise with your help. One of the exercises that we videotaped in our HarvardX course, but you're going to get the quick version of it. What did we do with this thing? This was in the Tangible Things exhibit in the corner of the room. It was in the muddle, and people were very curious about it because the sign on it said, worn by Harvard student David Haskins in 1836. Harvard student David Haskins in 1836? What on earth was going on? It was a puzzle because it didn't look like something. In fact, Samuel Eliot Morison, the great Harvard historian, said, oh, the young hellions in President Quincy's administration would never be caught in such a sissy outfit. Well, we started by looking. It does look a little bit feminine, or maybe it even looks like kitchen curtains. I'm not sure. As you look at this rows and rows and rows of fringe, trimming it. We investigated closely, hand-stitched, entirely handmade. And we looked, and then we tried to look more closely, and we could see the actual stitchery on this garment, and began to think about fasteners of different kinds. Here's a button, a very interesting hook and eye that's grown rusty, and it's been repaired. We can tell there was a bit of stress. This was a garment that was worn, and probably worn a lot. And then we were able to discover in the Harvard archives, where this costume is kept, a drawing by one of David Haskins' classmates. His name was Samuel Longfellow, and he identified it as the summer costume of the Cambridge students. Would you believe it? What was going on in 1836? There it is. It looks very much like David Haskins' toga, which is what he called it. So what do you think? Who wants to try on the toga? Believe me, the archivist didn't let me bring it. But because I think clothing is best understood on a body, I worked with a woman who had done theatrical costume, and she was able to come into the archives with me and with close measurements reconstruct this garment. Now, it's worn by a Harvard College student, but believe me, it's really quite little. Anybody want to try? Anybody here want to try putting this on? Okay. We will see if you can get into this thing. It's a little tight, isn't it? You're too muscular. No, not going to work. We need somebody else. Who's want to try this? And you know, okay, you come. We'll try this. We did this in class, and we ended up with, yes, a female person. Ah, that's better. Turn around. Okay, now what have we got here? We have a snap. This is authentic. All right, now I ask you, is this what a strapping young Harvard boy would wear? What do you think about this?
I wouldn't think so.
You wouldn't think so. Why not?
Well, for one thing, I'm a female, and I don't know that many men would have fit into it. However, it's a little bit feminine. So
And what now, okay, so what we always say to the students, you have just drawn a conclusion. So what do you mean by little bit feminine? Can you give me some very specific details about this garment that lead you to think that it's feminine?
the lace and the tassels there, I think, are a little bit more feminine.
Tassels.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
I'm trying to see.
You don't know. This is weird. This is weird.
A little bit. It
Yeah.
looks like a cloak that the women used to wear back in that time period. That they would in their winter dress as well. So
Yes. Is this warm?
No.
No. It's cool. So, what do you think? Come up and take a look.
Well, the fact that it's gathery and ruffle.
Okay. The trim, the gatherly, and this thing, which seems totally superfluous and kind of.
Especially if it's for summer when it's hot.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And what?
The cape is a little military if you took it away.
Oh, now here's a contrary thought. Maybe this has a little military. Does the fabric have a military look to it? No? Okay, let's have 5 ideas about this gown. 5 questions about this gown. Yes?
Are the scabs metal, and when were scabs like, if they are metal, when were they produced originally? So we can help date it.
Okay, so we want to look and see if there's a stamp of some kind that would help us date it. Well, it's well dated. 1836. Yes?
The hasty pudding, which were men by women, did that go back to 1836? The hasty pudding.
Say a little more.
Well, I went to one of their programs, enjoyed it a lot, although I went to Yale myself.
Yeah.
Where the Harvard men imitate women.
So you're suggesting it is a feminine garment worn in a kind of gender-bending way by the hasty pudding boys. That's a very interesting hypothesis. Anybody else? Yes?
What is the opening in the front? Is that to make sure that the outfit is cooler?
Yeah, it doesn't totally cover the body. So make a hypothesis, raise a question about that.
Was it to prevent sunburn?
Okay. Anybody? Well, a good question might be: was something meant to be worn under it? Yeah. Yes.
Is that a pocket inside?
Aha. Here's a pocket. Okay. What question does that raise for you?
I wonder if it's like something an artist would wear.
What might go in the pocket?
Like a French artist would think.
Oh, it does have a little of that feeling, doesn't it?
Except it's open.
Except it's open and it's not covering. Weird. Any comments over here? Yes.
I wonder if it's like a clergyman outfit. It's
What?
Like someone preparing for the priest.
What about it? Yep, if you'll keep doing this, you're doing a great job. What about it makes you think clergy?
So I guess just the tassels. I mean, I immediately actually thought about the Jewish wear with the tassels that you usually wear.
Okay.
So, but I was thinking perhaps that could just maybe the tassels could represent some kind of authority or something of that nature. It didn't seem like again this is used for rain or snow, but it could be used to
Something sort of ceremonial or to mark an identity of some kind.
Right.
Okay, you guys are great. One more on this side. Yes.
I wonder if they came in different colors, or were they the only?
Oh, the color. Is this would there be, and unfortunately with this black and white drawing, we don't know, but the surviving one, actually the slide it's quite faded, but it really would have been that bright, that particular one. Okay, so good.
Like where sometimes where you had like in the old days in schools you had like beanies and colorful sort of
so deliberately transgressive. Sort of like the hasty pudding, but maybe just...
This is just on it, like if you were part of the Cambridge students all wore bright green,
yeah.
things, and the other students wore purple something or I don't know.
Okay, what do students wear today around Harvard Square?
T-shirts.
What?
T-shirts.
T-shirts. And why? With writing on them. Interesting. Okay. You know, I had a student once turn in her senior thesis in her pajamas. I mean, there was a deadline, and if you didn't get it in, you didn't get it in, and she came tearing out of her dorm and got a cab to deliver. Didn't have time to get dressed and came in her pajamas. Have you ever seen any Harvard students in something akin to pajamas or recreational clothing or off? Yeah.
I think pajama bottoms are sold everywhere now. Wear every day.
Yeah.
Graduation?
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. Great. We're going to look at a few more slides, and afterwards, if anyone else wants to come up and try this on, you're more than welcome. Thank you. Oh, no, we got to put this back. I'm sorry. I forgot. Here we go. I mean, that does it, doesn't it? I mean, adding the hat just makes it perfect. Okay. Take a bow. Okay. Very, very good. All right. Well, I can't give you a totally complete answer to this, but the research that one of our students and then my co-teacher and I continued to work on. This is an interesting example, isn't it, from an earlier generation in the current Harvard Art Museum of Nicholas Boylston in his satin damask dressing gown. I mean, there is something about a high-status person dressed down coming out of the 18th century, a person of sensibility, there's a kind of intimacy in this portrait. Now, this is definitely not a damask satin dressing gown, but there is a precedent here for men wearing casual leisure wear outdoors, particularly in the summer. There's a great 18th century story about the men of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, strolling out on the bridge at night in their dressing gowns, and they take their hot wigs off and put in a cap like that. In the 19th century, sewing books turned out to be the most helpful source that we had, and I'm sorry I don't have a slide of the Workwoman's Guide from exactly this period, which has something very close to a pattern for this garment. And it is for men, women, and children, depending on size. It is a dressing gown, something that you would wear before you got dressed. And I don't know, I think they must have had some kind of a shirt under it. But it's a substitute for a jacket in the summertime for these boys, probably a little bit rebellious in parading around Cambridge in their straw hats and their dressing gown. Now, what's interesting, however, if we really go back now with new questions and start to look at the object itself, we begin to see details that we did not see before. It looks so casual and so odd that you don't realize that even though it is for at-home wear, it's actually quite stylish. the key thing is in the back, where there's a drawstring carefully worked in that I should have drawn close when our model was here, to tuck it in to give it a kind of flare when it's worn. And if we look at the nature of men's clothing in exactly the same period, here we are in formal wear, outdoor wear, what do you see here that's like the pinched weight, and the outline of men's and women's clothing is almost identical. Even though women wear skirts, they have these huge shoulders in the 1830s. And the cape. So, not just a cheap, casual thing, even though that's how it looks after more than a century. But there it is. And in the period of President Quincy's administration, Samuel Morrison was right about the, young hellions of Harvard who would never be caught in anything sissy. But this wasn't sissy. This was a handmade dressing gown made by Madam somebody or other who made it to order for them. And obviously the man who wore this, David Haskins, was very small, which is one reason it probably survived, because it couldn't be handed down to very many people. There were constant riots in Harvard in this period. David Haskins was a classmate of Henry David Thoreau. He was a classmate of, at a time when the anti-slavery movement was heating up, and President Quincy would not allow abolitionist speakers on campus. It was a time of great ferment when the Grimcase sisters of South Carolina were turning things upside down in Boston and through New England. And President Quincy's daughter created this beautiful pastoral image of Harvard in 1836 for the 200th anniversary of Harvard. But it wasn't a very pastoral place. It was in tumult at the time. And whether or not David Haskins was engaged in tumult or not, he certainly was part of a class that made their mark in the world by trying to push back against convention and try to do some of the things that you've all been suggesting college students sometimes do, including wearing a dressing gown around town in the summer. And here we are with the smallest young woman in our class dressing, getting dressed up. But one thing is wrong about this reproduction. And again, by looking closely, those of you who know textiles, the original garment was gingham. The pattern was woven. And when our seamstress, she had a hard time finding check as small as the original. And when the fabric came, she ordered it online. It was printed rather than woven into the fabric, which makes it more stiff. And it's not quite right because of the material. So, what did I do in the online course? We had a short video in which we raised this problem. We went in the archives. We looked at the original toga. We looked at documents. We looked at the student papers. And we talked about some of the things that I've talked about with you here. And then the question that I get constantly from people when I talk about doing an online course on tangible things is, that's not tangible. How can you do an online course and teach people how to take objects seriously? So just as an example, we had them read the chapter on economy from Walden, David Haskins' classmate, Henry David Thoreau. And then we asked them to think about whether this garment would fit Henry Thoreau's ideas about clothing in this period. And then we asked them to choose a garment of their own and do close looking, questioning, and connecting, and then see what they could learn about their own world from the garment, a favorite garment of their own, and then compare that with Thoreau's ideas about economy. And I just want to end by showing you one example. My choice of clothing are my shoes. I went for physical therapy the other day and had not been there for 2 years, and she commented, "These are the same shoes you were wearing." I have wide feet, which makes finding shoes a chore. I wear them to opera, restaurants, therapists, everywhere. They're ugly as hell, but they don't hurt my feet, which would fit Thoreau's ideas about clothing pretty well. Anyway, well, this is a kind of a quick case study in the kinds of things that we've tried to do. We've used rare basketry brought from Lewis and Clark on their expedition that ended up in the Harvard museums. We've looked at rare books. In Houghton, we've looked at beautiful things in the Semitic Museum and elsewhere. We end the online course with a Singer treadle sewing machine, which turns out to be a real trip around the world. And I encourage you to take a look at it if you're interested. Those courses are free. They cost you nothing. You can do as little or as much as you want. And if you see something there that interests you, let me know. And if you have tangible things that you think we should pay attention to, let us know that, because we're continuing to work on this course. So I thank you for your attention.
Time for some questions.
Comments, suggestions. Yes?
Oh, is the tangible things, is the online course going to run again?
Yes. The online course ran last May, I believe. It's going to run this August again. But the archived course is there. So if you don't want to, participate on online discussions and so on, just want to look at the videos, you can do that. Rob can maybe back me up on this or not, but I don't think of it actually as a course. I think of it as a series of explorations in adult education. And as a matter of fact, virtually everyone who signed up, we had about 13,000 people who took a look at the course. And of course, only a small percentage of those got a certificate. You get a certificate if you complete 75% of the work self-evaluated. It's for your edification. It's really a fascinating thing. Yes?
How can you relate these objects as they relate to history to objects within a family and how they relate to a family's history?
They're perfect. I actually have taught a course on American families where one of the options for students is to take an object from their own household, their own family, something maybe they've inherited, and move outwards. So every object came from somewhere. And every object has a story. Let me see if I can think of an example of something a student did. We were talking about ethnicity. And this student said, after we'd had a week or so to talk about ethnic traditions in American families, he said, I don't have any ethnicity. I don't know where my ancestors came from. I think my grandparents may have been Italian, but my father left home, and he kind of left all that behind. And so anyway, every student at the end of the semester had to work with some kind of family artifact or family story. It didn't have to be their own. We could supply things for them to work with if they didn't want to work on their own. And at the end of the semester, this student, a mind-blowing project, he started exploring the extended family and ended up locating his collateral relative of his father, who had had such a successful Italian restaurant in upstate New York that the town had painted a brick wall with a mural honoring her food. And he went up there, discovered this history he didn't know he had, and then he made Italian cookies for the whole class and distributed them. So everybody's got a story somewhere. And family relics are a very interesting place to begin. Yes?
How does the use of the word toga in 1836 reflect on what they thought about ancient Rome back then?
I don't know. It doesn't look like a toga, does it? However, there are statues in the period where, you know how they created white marble statues of important people looking like Romans? And there is one that he has what looks for all the world like a dressing gown. Not this one, but just a loose garment with sleeves and kind of flowing around his body. So I don't know. There's a question. There's a question somebody could work on. That's where these investigations begin. So a linguistic question. Yeah. Yes?
Going back to what you started with, which is Holyoke Center.
Yes.
You know, that's being turned into a community visitor center. And I was at the opening, the planning for that. And I was shocked to find out there are no plans to exhibit maps or objects of Harvard's own history, which, as you know, the college started right across the street, Thomas Shepard's house and so forth.
Harvard.
We would lobby Harvard.
Please, I ask you to join me. There needs to be a dedicated gallery, not necessarily for Harvard history, you know, as usually defined, but where these wonderful materials can cross and connect with each other. I think you could tell an amazing story about Harvard through changing selections of things that don't get attention in their major collections, but are of great interest.
Well, they were one and the same because
Yes.
Town became Cambridge because
Right.
colleges. I mean, but it's a story that has to be told, and there are all sorts of plaques around, but people don't know.
That's right.
They have these huge walls where things could be.
Maps, I mean, they're,
You have to go over there and lobby.
yeah, well, you know, faculty don't have any influence, but neighbors and alum have great influence. So I invite you to do that. We'd love to be involved. Yes?
Have you thought about how to deal with digital content, which is becoming more prominent in all our lives?
Yeah. Digital content, yes, I haven't personally, but the libraries are deeply engaged, and I think what you're asking is not how we use digitization, which everybody does every day, but how we preserve digital content, things that are born digital. Some of the libraries are working on that. I know the Schlesinger Library is working very, very hard on that, on the ephemeral kinds of things, blogs, for example. and it has to be sampled. You can't save everything, but it is something that is being discussed. I'm no expert on that, but I know it's on the marketplace. I will say I gave a workshop once at a museum in Milwaukee, kind of a think tank, and we had this interesting game with students who were coming for a workshop where the curator had them come into a barn, a storage area on the property we were using, and he mixed things that had value with stuff that was just being stored in the barn to see if these curators in training could tell the difference. I mean, he had them choose objects they thought were important and they wanted to interpret. And to my astonishment, the most popular object in that whole experiment was the Kodak carousel, which they'd never seen, didn't know what it was, and were totally fascinated. I mean, and some of you in this room know what a Kodak carousel is from an old slide projector, but those things are fast disappearing and are important parts of our history. Yes?
What about in the visitor center if you just put a history of Cambridge in general and how it changed?
Yeah. Well, do you remember the dioramas? Anybody here remember the dioramas? I think they're in storage somewhere. Probably. Who knows? Yeah.
One more question?
Yeah.
Of all of the different things that you've found across the years, what is one of your favorites and why?
Whatever I'm working on is my favorite. But I will tell you about one that blew me away. Have any of you heard of the ladies of Llangollen? Well, there were 18th century ladies who eloped together and established their own cottage in Wales. So they became famous. They were visited by every poet and politician because of their ability to create the ideal, refined country life. And Houghton Library has the most exquisite little embroidered portfolio/book done in satin with spangles into the embroidery, and tiny, it's about 3 by 5 inches, opens up. On one side is this little handmade watercolor book of their castle with some French poetry, and on the other side a silver reticule, a little tiny little bag done in silver thread netting. It's in the Rare Books Library at Harvard, and with very secure provenance of having been given as a gift to one of their patrons in the 18th century. So you never know what you're going to find. Thank you.
Join me in thanking you all. I think Laurel will be here for a few minutes. If you'd like to